what I'm speaking about today is Revolting Prostitutes, The Fight for Sex Workers' Rights by Juna Mack and Molly Smith. And it's a book about, next slide please, sex workers' rights from an intersectional feminist labour rights perspective. So basically I saw Molly and Juno speak at the Radical Book Festival in Edinburgh maybe like 2 years ago. And I read it back then and I was just so impressed by them. They're so amazing and they spoke so well. But I read it again this year because it seems like sex work and sex workers' rights has kind of come up in the media this year with things like OnlyFans making kind of versions of sex work a lot more accessible to folks. So it feels quite relevant, and hopefully the takeaways from the book that I'll be sharing today will give you maybe a better understanding or an alternative understanding to sex work and rights. So the first takeaway is sex work is work. So this is the foundation to the entire book. So when we stop focusing on the sex part of work, when we focus more on the work part of sex work, we begin to think of sex work in the same ways we would think about our own work. So for example, if you work as a contractor or a freelancer, which I'm sure a lot of people here do, you benefit hugely from asking for advice on your pricing or pricing your services, having nice meetups like this and groups of support, having public platforms where you can advertise your services and pre-vet your clients, having shared workspaces like a hot desking area. But many countries have restrictive laws that mean these benefits that we kind of take for granted are not necessarily offered to sex workers. In the US, for example, many websites where sex workers can communicate their services and pre-vet clients are taken down. In the UK, if you just pop to the next slide, we have a partial criminalisation model where, thank you so much. Back one, yeah. Where some aspects of the industry, often the most visible, such as street-based sex work, are criminalised. Within England, Scotland and Wales, the acts of buying and selling sex are legal, but almost everything else is criminalised. So for example, soliciting, or quote, curb crawling is what they call it, working indoors with friends, or facilitating sex work. So this is all illegal. So this means that meeting clients in a safe space, for example, is not possible. And by a safe space, I mean like outdoors, like soliciting work outdoors. Working with friends is not possible. So if you have more than one sex worker living in a house, or someone who facilitates sex work to kind of keep them safe, that's illegal because it's considered a brothel. So I guess if this was the case for us as workers, and we're not as vulnerable as sex workers, if we couldn't do the things that we really benefit from, like we wouldn't feel that great about it, and it would negatively impact us. So I guess it's worth considering that this happens for a lot of sex workers. So the next takeaway is think twice before calling the police. So the police system does not benefit sex workers is kind of one of the points that the book argues. The power the police have over vulnerable folks can be devastating, particularly for trans, Black and migrant sex workers. And I guess if this year has taught us anything, it's that the police do not always have the best interests at heart for many in the society. And while this is not a call to walk away when you think a sex worker, or anyone for that matter, is in danger, it's a call to be more cognizant of what the outcome for that person might be. So the book outlines many examples of women and sex workers being arrested, quote, for their own good, under the assumption that women would have a better, safer life locked up. Given the way the prison system works and the fact that folks in the sex industry are likely already in difficult situations with things like drugs, poverty, childcare, this is not exactly a great alternative. Often the workers end up deported, have their money taken from them, or have their families taken from them. And with the video footage that we've all been exposed to of late, and that many people have experienced for decades, it's very clear that alternative services might be better placed in helping people. So for example, Swarm, so that's SWARM, or Umbrella Lane in Glasgow, both offer support services and outreach programs. And it might be worth considering if you find yourself or someone in a situation where they're in sex work and might be in danger. So the third takeaway is your feminism is not intersectional enough. So the book makes it very clear that their position is not that the sex industry is valuable or desirable in itself. And as feminists, they understand the misogyny and violence that's experienced in the sex trade to be apparent. But to humanely abolish sex work, it would mean that marginalized people no longer have to sustain themselves through the sex industry. So it would no longer be necessary for survival. So as a feminist, you can't just focus on those two aspects of the industry, the misogyny and the violence. You must be more intersectional. You must care about winning rights for freedom of movement, labor rights, access to services and to work without the threat of deportation, employment alternatives, better welfare provisions, cheaper housing, support services for single mothers, all of which make sex work unnecessary. And the book argues that if all of these resources were provided, then nobody would really need to sell sex, which is why I'm a massive fan of universal basic income, but I feel like that's a whole other talk. So many books I could talk about on that one. Maybe I'll make a comeback tour. So yeah. The fourth takeaway is that the Nordic model is not the perfect solution. So many people might have heard about the Nordic model and maybe aren't too sure what it is or feel like it's a great solution, but maybe don't know the ins and outs. So if you just pop to the next slide, I've put a definition there for you. So the Nordic model, defined by this book, is a legal regime that criminalises the purchase of sex and punishes third parties such as managers, drivers, and landlords, while ostensibly decriminalising those who sell sex. So some might think that criminalising one side of that buy-sell dynamic would increase power to the side of the sellers, so the sex worker, because they're no longer seen as illegal, their work isn't illegal. However, this is not the case for sex workers, as it bases the idea on a perfect supply and demand model. When you reduce demand through criminalisation, you expect the supply to eventually reduce, but the supply side is sex workers who need to sell sex for money, and it's their only form of income. It essentially turns it into a buyer's market, which shrinks the market to the point where pricing is essentially a race to the bottom. So the Nordic model doesn't make the seller safer, it just makes the seller more likely to do dangerous things to make their client at ease and to make money. And the safe clients no longer, well, what would be considered safe before if it was legal, they no longer purchase because they're kind of scared of being arrested. So the clientele are kind of riskier. And for those forced to the streets, life has become a lot harder. So the law on purchase of sex has made working as a prostitute harder and more dangerous. And I guess we understand that, right? Like imagine if your job criminalized your clients, you'd be more likely to accept work that paid less on riskier terms just to make ends meet. Or alternatively, you'd move industry, but I guess that's quite a privileged thing to say. There's a general consensus that many folks who go into the sex industry do it because there are little to no other options for them. So what do they expect those workers to do? Now, the Nordic model does offer a, quote, exit scheme, but the book argues that there's little funding in the scheme and that it doesn't really offer a good enough alternative. It doesn't consider a better alternative for sex workers and prostitutes to leave. And so they're left in a dangerous situation, essentially. So the last takeaway is kind of their proposal of what is a good kind of way to manage sex work. And that's decriminalize, not legalize. So there's a difference between decriminalizing and legalizing, which a lot of people kind of confuse when they speak about prostitution. So if you want to pop to the next slide, this is from the authors. So legalization would mean the regulation of prostitution with laws regarding where, when, and how prostitution could take place. Whereas decriminalization eliminates all laws and prohibits the state and law enforcement officials from intervening in any prostitution-related activities or transactions unless other laws apply. So essentially, legalization is defined as legalizing some sex work in some contexts when it's rolled out. And often it means heavily controlling what folks can and can't do. They're considered to be regulatory models, so models that legalize certain aspects of sex work, and it's what we think of when we think of the Netherlands and Amsterdam. I suppose everyone sees Amsterdam as kind of maybe like a shining light for sex work, but they have a legal model or a regulatory model. This selective mindset is quite damaging for sex workers. So for example, in Turkey, they have a regulatory model and trans workers are not allowed to be prostitutes. Regulationism, so that's like a kind of term that they use interchangeably with legalization, encourages illegal behavior. So most countries, this is so interesting, most countries that have legalized aspects of sex work have more illegal, unregulated sex trade than the legal side of the sex industry in the same country. And legalization generally profits other folks than the sex workers themselves. So for example, it's generally only legal to work for someone else, like a brothel or a manager, but not alone as a freelancer. Decriminalisation is a situation where sex work is legal as the default. So it sees sex workers more as workers, and it brings the work to a level where labour laws can come into play. So essentially it just evens out the playing field. It means that we're all just labourers and workers fighting for better rights. And what falls out of the perspective of decriminalisation is a system where the knowledge, safety, and rights of people who sell sex are prioritised. And in order to do this, the regulations placed on the sex industry are shaped by the sex workers themselves. So New Zealand, for example, have this in place right now. And while the book is still critical of New Zealand's model, the imperfections are broader than the sex industry. So they speak about border control and treatment of migrants, welfare support. So like these are things that impact all of us as workers and not just punitively sex workers. And that's it. So as a quick wrap up, so sex work is work. Think twice before calling the police. Your feminism is not intersectional enough. The Nordic model is not the perfect solution. And decriminalise, not legalise. And just as a quick point, like the two authors who wrote this, Juno Mack and Molly Smith, they both work in the sex industry. I don't work in the sex industry, so I'm not speaking on behalf of like a ton of people. I'm just saying what I learned from the book. It was super fascinating, but I really recommend reading it because I always feel uncomfortable maybe speaking on behalf of other people in that kind of way. But yeah, and those two organisations that I mentioned are super helpful and UK based. Both Juno and Molly are UK based sex workers as well. So this is kind of coming from that lens. So yeah, that's me.
5 Things!